welcome to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Verdig, and I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-founder and co-director of Jane Austen and Company. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. If you've missed our previous programs, don't worry, you can find them all recorded on our website, janeaustenandco.org. We all hope that you have enjoyed this series this season and will consider supporting our venture in the future by sharing your opinions or by donating to the Jane Austen Summer Program. Donations help support programming such as tonight's program, as well as our teacher scholarships and essay contests. We'll talk more about how you can support our series in the future after the talk, so please stick around the full length of the event. And now I'm happy to welcome you all to the 8th and penultimate program in our 2021 series, Race and the Regency. Tonight, Juliette Wells is presenting a special session on teaching Jane Austen, incorporating important topics into class with students. But before we begin, I'd like to hand things over once again to my colleague, Dr. Danielle Christmas, to speak some more about what this series means this year.
Hello, everyone. At this point, those of you who've been here could probably tell me who I am, but in case you haven't been here, or in case you forget 2 weeks ago, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about me. My name is Danielle Christmas, and I'm an assistant professor of English and Comparative Literature at UNC Chapel Hill. I research and teach about the relationship between cultural production, like Jane Austen's novels, and their socioeconomic context, including the economic politics of slavery. It is this work that has allowed me to co-host this series, Race and the Regency, which will be running through the end of this month. The speakers in this series explore the roles of race, nationalism, imperialism, and identity in the works and times of Jane Austen, as well as in literary and film adaptations of the time period. Perhaps you attended my talk on the Zong crisis in Mansfield Park this past February, or joined us for another lecture by any number of the featured speakers we've had the honor of hosting since then. If so, and you are back in anticipation of this entirely different and yet wholly connected presentation on how to make race and the Regency accessible in the classroom, then you already understand the ethos of this series: to gather a diverse cross-section of intellectual and professional points of view and grow together in conceptualizing what race means for understanding the Regency and what Jane Austen's Regency means for our own complicated notions of race. I know that I speak for all of us when I say how, based on your presence and enthusiastic curiosity thus far, we are thrilled by the prospects of what a series like Race and the Regency has already achieved and what we can achieve moving forward in this program and others like it with your continued presence and financial support. So thank you for joining us, and welcome back for this 9th event in Race and the Regency.
And now a word from my co-director, Dr. Inga Brody.
Hi, this is Inga Brody. I'm so grateful to Danielle for sharing her expertise and being willing to co-host this series with us. And to Anne, who is the founder of the very first Jane Austen and Company events. We started in libraries regionally, and we're happy when our numbers were in the teens. And we've been able to innovate with the pandemic with a strong silver lining, and now reaching people in the hundreds every time we have an event, which is lovely. And I'm the director of the Jane Austen Summer Program, which is the umbrella organization for Jane Austen and Company and also some other Austen related ventures. And it is my honor to introduce Juliette Wells. Juliette Wells is Elizabeth Connolly Todd Distinguished Professor of English in the Center for the Humanities at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland. She's authored most recently of Reading Austen in America, a vivid account of how an appreciative audience for Austen's novels originated and developed in America, and how American readers contributed to the rise of Austen's international fame. Her earlier book, the great title, Everybody's Jane, Jane in the Popular Imagination, explored the importance of Austen to readers and fans today. Both of these books highlight Goucher College's exceptional Jane Austen collection and its creator, alumna Alberta H. Burke. For Penguin Classics, Dr. Wells also created a reader-friendly 200th anniversary editions of Austen's novels, Persuasion and Emma. Beyond Austen, her writings also include a co-edited book on the Brontes in the world of the arts, and numerous articles on topics ranging from George Eliot to chick lit. She's an acclaimed speaker to popular and scholarly audiences, and she serves with me on the editorial board of Persuasions, the journal of the Jane Austen Society of North America. Before we hear from Juliette, I know we're all waiting for that, I want to also hand things over to our technical director, Emily Sfera, who's going to go over how things will work tonight, for those of you who are new especially.
Hi, everyone. I am Emily. I am the technical director, and I am a doctoral student here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'd like to take a moment to explain how tonight's event will work. The event will last about 90 minutes in total. Throughout and after Juliette's event, you are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a chat box that many of you have found already, and then a separate Q&A box for content-based questions. Inger, Danielle, and Anne will use the questions in the Q&A box and ask them to Juliette. And if you'd like to chat with other attendees, please use the chat box instead. Don't put questions for Juliette in the chat box. They will be lost, and Anne, Inger, and Danielle will likely not be able to see them. Also, if you've joined us before, you know that we typically enjoy a very robust chat. If you would like to hide the chat and hide it and don't want to, you might find it distracting, there are a few steps you can take. If you are on desktop, the easiest way for you to get rid of the chat is to open the chat box here at the bottom of your screen and then just pull it all the way off of your screen. So put it down in the corner, up in the corner, somewhere where you won't see it. And that way, because the chat box is open, the pop-up notifications will not come up on your screen. Now, if you are on a tablet or a phone, you have the ability to mute your chat. So what you would do is, again, click the chat button, then click the little bell, and afterwards, the bell will give you the option to click mute. And if you do that, again, you won't see any notifications from the chat. Also, as you likely have seen, we do have closed captions on tonight. Sorry about that, you disappeared for a moment. So we do have closed captions on tonight, and if you find the closed captions distracting, please click on the CC box on the bottom banner of your Zoom window, and you should be able to turn them off from there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. Please note that tonight's program will be recorded, and we will notify you all via our Facebook page and website when it is available to view. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Juliette Wells.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily and Anne, for all your help. Thank you, Inger and Danielle, for the invitation. And thank you all for spending part of your evening here. We were comparing notes on weather here in the suburbs of Baltimore. It is supposed to thunderstorm and hail, so you might hear that through my window. But it's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you. I hope that what I have to share with you will lead to a conversation through our Zoom webinar medium. In some cases, I know this is a continuing conversation. I see some familiar colleagues with whom I've talked about teaching Austen many times over the years, and I look forward to hearing from those of you whom I don't yet know. And I particularly hope that this will be an opportunity for secondary teachers and college and university teachers to compare notes and talk with each other, which is something I often feel we would all benefit from having more opportunities to do. I was reminded this week of how topical the theme of this series is when Jane Austen once again came back into the news. In this case, I'm sure most of you have seen Jane Austen's House Museum announce that it planned to update its displays and exhibitions with more historical context, including connections between the Austen family and enslaved peoples. And this blew up in the conservative press in the UK in particular. So here is the New York Times coverage on the left and LitHub doing a roundup of what you need and don't need to know about the manufactured Jane Austen controversy. And I have to say, the comments section on the New York Times article is a refresher. I found it a refresher, not just the choir to whom I feel I'm often preaching to, but a reminder of those out there whose ideas are in a different place with respect to Jane Austen and her historical contexts. I'm going to beg your indulgence for a really quick overview of Goucher's Austen collection. It has not the strongest claim to be relevant to the topic of diversity, but it does have a claim. And since I know many of you are hearing about Goucher's collection for the first time, I am going to indulge myself, and I thank you for your patience. I'm going to move quickly through these slides. Our main collector, who bequeathed the majority of her collection upon her death in 1975, was Alberta Hersheimer Burke, graduated from Goucher in 1928. There's a picture of her, and a picture of her with her supportive and adoring husband. So wonderful to have a literary collector who's a woman who is supported by a man. And for those of you who are familiar with or members of the Jane Austen Society of North America, JASNA, Harry Burke was one of the 3 co-founders of the organization. And Goucher holds JASNA's archives, as well as Alberta Burke's collection and subsequent collections donated to the college library. In Alberta's collection originally was a handful, I would say about a dozen manuscript items in Jane Austen's handwriting, a few in Cassandra's, including this pivotal item in which Cassandra Austen noted down her recollections of the dates of composition of Austen's novels, so a really crucial historical document. Alberta Burke collected first editions of Austen's novels, first English editions, certainly. She also acquired one of the very few surviving copies of the first American edition of an Austen novel, and this is something that I've had the joy to research, her book plate there and her copy. And I must acknowledge and thank the Goucher Library for its digital project, Emma in America. This is a complete open access, free, very beautifully designed digital edition of the 1816 Philadelphia Emma, the only novel of Jane Austen's that was published in the United States in her lifetime. And since only 6 copies are known to survive, you and I will never own one. And so we must call up this website on our iPads and experience what American readers would have read if they had bought the first American-made copy. In Alberta's collection and now at Goucher, also illustrated editions of Austen, such as the first illustrated editions from the 1830s, the Bentley editions. And where did my cursor go? There it went. This is the claim, I think, to a connection to diversity and to Goucher's current emphasis on global studies. Alberta Burke was widely traveled, and wherever she went to the local bookshop and bought the translations of Austen that were available at the time. And she also had her friends and acquaintances send her translated copies that they found around the world. So Goucher is the only library that we know of in the world that has a significant, substantial collection of Jane Austen as translated into many different languages. And we recently received a gift from Edith Lank, a JASNA member from Rochester who collected translations in the 1980s until quite recently. So that complements our holdings from Alberta Burke. Alberta Burke was keenly interested in envisioning Austen's world, and so she also collected contextual sources of all kinds that cast light on social customs, dance, fashion, costume, dress, architecture, and beyond. And my Goucher Library colleagues and I are early in the process of making more of this material digitally available to teachers of Austen, fans and readers of Austen around the world. Absolutely indescribable, yet precious to us, and certainly key to our digitization efforts are the 10 scrapbooks that Alberta Burke kept over the 45 years of her Austen collecting, in which she pasted, with no archival quality glue stick or Scotch tape, every reference to Austen that she and her friends found in every publication of the time. And you can see that in her era, this is not how the volumes look now, in her era, she also treated these notebooks as her files for the correspondence relating to her collection. So moving away from Alberta, although I'm happy to talk about her more in the Q&A if you are interested, what I have to share with you today comes from two companion piece articles that I have been working on. And here's the information about where they will appear if you are interested in more from them. The one I wrote first is the one titled Race, Privilege, and Relatability, a practical guide for college and secondary instructors. And that is coming out this summer in the Routledge Companion to Jane Austen, in which most, all of my fellow Austen scholars have chapters, and Inger has written about the Jane Austen summer program, and it's going to be a huge, wonderful book. We are all looking forward to seeing it. And more recently, for the Persuasions Online special issue on Austen and diversity, which is also coming out this summer, I wrote about a new course of mine, a first-year college seminar that I offered last fall, and the title of the course gave the article its title, Pride and Prejudice, Here and Now. So most of what I will be sharing comes from the first article, but some from the second one. And I open the Routledge article by posing a question to the silent readers. So I pose these questions to you, and I invite you to think about them and perhaps put an answer or a question of your own in response. What do you find difficult about teaching Austen to your particular students? And if you say, oh, I'm not a teacher, I think we're all teachers in a way. So you might teach in a classroom, or you might find yourself explaining Austen or advocating for Austen outside of a classroom. What do you find difficult about those efforts? And then my second question, what do your students report is challenging for them about reading Austen? Or maybe it's not your students, maybe it's your neighbors or your friends or the people in your book club or whoever is trying to read Austen. What do they report is difficult? In the Routledge chapter, I address many possible responses to those questions. And for the purposes of this series, I'm going to zero in today on the response that might come. I don't relate to Austen's novels because I'm not white, and she takes it for granted that her characters are white. I don't see myself in Austen's novels because of race, because of ethnicity, because of nationality. And when I started thinking about these questions in relation to my own teaching at Goucher, where I've been since 2012, I called to mind students who said pretty much just that in a Jane Austen seminar. And when I thought about how to handle responses, reactions like that in the classroom, I found myself coming up empty-handed when I turned to my go-to resources on teaching Austen, such as the MLA approaches to teaching Jane Austen's novels. I've found that my colleagues have tended to write about content, about imparting important content to our students so that they can think critically about Jane Austen's novels and not focus on their personal responses. And I found myself moving in absolutely the opposite direction as I thought about my students of today and what their encounters with Austen are like and can be like. And I found myself, as the subtitle of that article suggests, wanting to provide a practical guide for navigating the real life challenges and the opportunities for connection that come when secondary and undergraduate students are really comfortable speaking freely about their experiences of reading Austen. And as you could tell from Inger's intro, I work on Austen's historical readers. But the historical readers of the future are the readers of the present. So I'm keenly interested in what my students have to say as they're reading, in response to their reading, to each other. And I see this endeavor of mine as very closely connected to the two editions for Penguin Classics that Inger also mentioned. Those were Penguin Classics' effort to create a new kind of edition. And we got to do Austen first, which is always wonderful. A new kind of edition that would be a handheld one-stop shop, everything that you might need, reader of today, to support your understanding and appreciation of an Austen novel. Not too much, not too little, just right. And really pivotal, crucial to that effort was not talking down to readers for whom Austen's world feels different, distant, unfamiliar. So accessibility was the main aim there. And the other change of heart that I've had that you can infer from the title of the Routledge chapter is regarding the concept and the word relatability, or what is relatable. I inveighed for years against the term relatable, even though it seemed like it ought to be a really great word because it's one word and it saves you having to say a whole phrase. But I felt it wasn't a real word, and the OED backed me up. It didn't have any references except to spoken English. And I have completely changed my tune. I now firmly believe that relatability, concept and term, are the key to helping students of today connect with Jane Austen. And the more so if students respond to a question of what is challenging for them in reading Austen, if they say they can't relate. Obviously, it's not helpful for me to say, well, relatability is not what we're about in college level study of literature. Better far to acknowledge that we each read from our personal experience, we read from who we are, we read from our life experiences, and that the differences among these, among us, enrich our work of collaborative analysis and interpretation. So, in the Routledge chapter, I try an approach which I hope will serve others, especially those who are not Austen scholars by trade, who want and need really short, pithy, accessible answers to the questions that students commonly ask. So that's the approach that I took in that chapter. And there are other chapters in that Routledge Companion that offer much fuller scholarly treatments of the same topics or related topics. But I had student voices in my head, and I was thinking of the classroom where you have a few minutes to answer something on the fly. So if students ask you, what roles did people of color have in Austen's day, in Austen's England? Or if they ask, what legal status did enslavement have and what views about enslaved people were held? You would point out that people of color lived and worked in England's cities and elsewhere in England, especially in populous London. You might point out that dark-skinned people appear in portraits and artworks of the time. You might point your students to the film Belle from 2014, which imagines the experiences of one multiracial person, Dido Bell, the young ward of a wealthy English family in the late 18th century. You would certainly mention that the international slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1807, but not until 1833 were enslaved people in the British Empire freed. You could also point out that indigenous inhabitants of European colonies were often referred to and treated in dehumanizing and prurient ways. And you might mention in particular the exhibition in London in 1810 to 1812 of Sarah Bartman, who was known so-called as the Hottentot Venus. You might also find it useful to point out that hierarchies were present within groups of British people, Britons, who are now generally viewed as white. You might point out that colonial attitudes of the English elite towards the Scots and Irish people resulted in the denigration of those ethnicities. And if your students go on to say, well, did Austen know anybody who was of color? Was she personally acquainted with any people of color? Then you could say her surviving letters don't refer to her seeing or meeting or knowing anyone of a different race or ethnicity, although she may have done so. We know that her surviving letters don't tell us everything about her life. And I like to point to Sheila Johnson Kindred's recent book on Fanny Palmer Austen, Austen's sister-in-law, who grew up in Bermuda in households with enslaved servants in a system that was less harsh than the West Indian plantations. Sheila Johnson Kindred hypothesizes that Fanny Austen may well have discussed her experiences with her sister-in-law, Jane Austen, and that Jane Austen may well have drawn on those conversations and correspondences in her depiction of naval wives in Persuasion in particular. Your students might ask, in which of Austen's writings does she directly address race, ethnicity, or enslavement, and how does she do so? They might ask, or perhaps these questions sound more like my version of students' questions rather than their own voice, but how does she describe characters in ways that seem racialized to us today? And then you would probably start with Sanditon, which probably your students did not see on PBS last year, but they might have seen some of the social media about the casting. You would mention that Jane Austen created a character in Sanditon whom the narrator identifies in a term that some would consider a racial slur. the term half mulatto. Jocelyn Harris, in her recent book on Austen, points out that Austen seems to have coined this term and that it is certainly puzzling, if not also offensive. You would point out that Mansfield Park contains Austen's most direct references to the enslavement of people in British colonies through discussions of the dependence of the Bertram family on the profits of their plantation in Antigua. And I would encourage you also to mention the Gypsies episode in Emma, which is almost fully elided from the recent film by Autumn de Wilde, but for people who are reading Emma, the Gypsies episode really demands consideration. The supposed threat to an orderly English village posed by the Romany people who had been present in England for centuries. And then certainly you would go on, and in the discussion about Jane Austen's House Museum and its exhibitions, many have pointed out that Austen treats the topic of slavery also figuratively and via implication. So that's Jane Fairfax and Emma comparing the governessing trade to the slave trade. Mrs. Elton in the same novel, who professes to be appalled by Jane's comparison, comes from the city of Bristol, formerly a major port in the international slave trade, and of course recently in the news for having statues pulled down and gloriously replaced, at least briefly gloriously replaced. And also there is new research from my colleague Mary Favrette at Johns Hopkins and also Margie Burns and Jasna on the usage of the phrase pride and prejudice in abolitionist rhetoric during and after Austen's lifetime, both in Britain and the USA. It's the racialized descriptions are ones that students will often bring out. They will say, what does this mean? Could this character be a character of color? I'm seeing descriptions of skin tone, of hair that are suggestive. And so just a couple of them, it might be Miss Bingley's description of Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice as having grown brown and coarse as a result of being out in the sun. But Mary Crawford is described by the narrator as having a clear brown complexion, and she's a beautiful character. Ditto Marianne Dashwood. Her skin was very brown, but from its transparency, her complexion was uncommonly brilliant. I find that my traditionally college-age students are really unaccustomed to seeing descriptors like brown and for those descriptors not to indicate a multiracial person or a person of color. If you remember, Austen's narrator is describing Mr. Darcy as tall, dark, and handsome. You are misremembering. He is not, in fact, dark. He has a fine, tall person, handsome features, and noble mien. But several of Austen's other men do present an appearance that the narrator or other characters refer to as dark, such as Henry Crawford in Mansfield Park strikes the Bertram sisters as being black and plain. Captain Harville in Persuasion, the narrator introduces as a tall, dark man. And in Northanger Abbey, follow this one, it's a little intricate. Isabella Thorpe is quoting to Catherine Morland, Catherine's description of Henry Tilney. And if we trust this sequence of attributions, Henry has a brown skin with dark eyes and rather dark hair. So I wanted to be sure in this book chapter to highlight what adaptations and also readers and fan communities add to our discussion and understanding of these issues. So with respect to race and ethnicity, there's so much to say. Your students might bring examples to you, but you can point out, if they don't, that to date, no period screen adaptation of one of Austen's 6 major novels has included people of color in central or noticeable roles. I am certain that is about to change, since period adaptations in general, I'm thinking of Dev Patel and David Copperfield, the Howard Zinn from several years ago, this is changing all around Austen. Certainly it will change in Austen. But in the meantime, when Austen is adapted to the stage plays, musicals, operas, performers of color have been in those casts for some time. Among period film adaptations, and I'm sure this comes to mind for many of you, Patricia Rozema's Mansfield Park from 1999 stands out for its explicit, sustained treatment of enslavement and abuses. Although I have to say my students' responses to that film by now are, what was she doing with that topic and why did she handle it that way? They do not see her treatment of that as necessarily working almost more than 20 years later. Among adaptations set in the present day, film adaptations, Gurinder Chadha's Bollywood-inspired Bride and Prejudice most fully imagines Austen in an international context, although post-colonial scholars have done much to show the limits of Chadha's imagination and portrayal there. And it may be true that some of your students are still watching the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, the YouTube series, or its follow-ups, Emma Approved and Welcome to Sanditon. All of those are set in 21st century America, and they prominently feature characters and actors of color. So far, most professionally and fan-authored fiction inspired by Austen's novels steers clear of race and ethnicity, but of course there are important exceptions, such as Pride. Evie Zopoy was an earlier presenter on this very series, and I and my teacher colleagues are already making wonderful use of her novel in the classroom. Set in the gentrifying Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn with a socioeconomically diverse cast of Haitian and Dominican American characters. Many of you will also know Sonia Kamal's witty novel Unmarriageable from 2019, which transposes Pride and Prejudice to present day Pakistan and comes with a wonderful essay by Sonia at the end in which she considers her own reading of Austen beginning in girlhood in a post-colonial context, and how she makes connections between Austen and other women writers from different traditions. More loosely, Sonali Dev's Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavors, also published in 2019, suggests connections between Austen's world and that of a prosperous Indian American family. There are others, that is just a handful. Certainly you could also mention in this context the problematic television adaptation of Sanditon. Publicity for that really highlighted the role of the character Miss Lamb, played by Crystal Clark. And this would be an opportunity for a student to go out and do some research and report back. A student could review responses to the Sanditon adaptation and social media concerning it to open a useful classroom conversation about Austen and race. You could also screen selected scenes from the Sanditon miniseries. And I have another suggestion for sparking discussion, but I'll stave it till later. And then finally, if your students are curious, and even if they're not, they should be, help them be curious about the ways in which racial and ethnic diversity are present in Austen's readership and her fandom today. Social media is probably the place to start here. Podcasts, websites, blogs, conversations, responses to provocations. There is so much to discover. But if you would like to refer back to books, you could come back to Azar Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran from 2003, one of several excellent books treating how readers outside the Anglo-American context respond to Austen's novels today. Less well known, but I also strongly recommend B. Rowlett and May Witwit's Talking About Jane Austen in Baghdad from 2010. The members of the Jane Austen Society of Pakistan have been widely interviewed, including on the BBC and NPR. That's not a book, but I slipped it in there. And then Sonia Kamal's essay that I mentioned before. Elements of Austen's novels that resonate with all these readers include the strict social hierarchies that she depicts and the social mores, as well as the struggles of women characters to attain self-actualization within a patriarchal society. And this year, more than any previous year, there has been such lively discussion on social media among fans who identify as people of color and Janeites, and have been thinking together and thinking for a variety of audiences about how those aspects of their intersectional identities, I hesitate to say that being a Janeite is part of intersectionality, but I think it can be. Again, students could survey those conversations and report back to your classroom. So here's the discussion prompt I mentioned a moment ago. So here I asked you questions before, and now I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are an incoming college first-year student. You are attending your first class of a first-year seminar titled Pride and Prejudice, Here and Now, and you are traditional college age. You are 17 or 18, maybe 19. And it's fall 2020, so you are not on Goucher's campus. You are at home via Zoom. You are in Texas, you are in Arizona, California, New York, Maryland, maybe. And you have not read any Jane Austen. you chose the course title out of many course titles because you are interested in literature, or you're interested in the concept of prejudice today, or as several of the students told me, their mother, their teacher, somebody in their life recommended that they read Jane Austen, but they haven't read anything yet. We haven't opened Pride and Prejudice yet. And I show you this oil painting. And I included all the details about it, including its size, because when we show images digitally, we don't know if they're the size of our palm or the size of a wall. And it's important to know that this is a life-sized portrayal of this fellow. And so I asked my first year students last fall, what do you see in this portrait? Is it a portrait? What do you see in this painting? What does this fellow look like to you? And they commented, he looks confident. He's standing in a relaxed way, but he looks like he's in command of himself. He's not smiling, he's not frowning, he's looking serious, he's making eye contact with the viewer. They commented on the artist's portrayal of his skin tone in grayscale rather than in shades of brown or black. They commented on his colorful sweatshirt. One student pointed out that it looks like a cityscape seen through windows, a contrast with the background color and also his skin color. And I asked them, what do you think this title means in relation to the painting? A single man in possession of a good fortune. And they thought about it. And they said, he must have good luck. He has good fortune. That connects with his confidence and the sense of presence and poise that we get from him. And before we opened up Pride and Prejudice and we saw that, of course, Amy Sherald, the artist, had borrowed Jane Austen's opening line to apply to her subject, I showed the students some other artworks by Amy Sherald that were part of this same exhibition at the Hauser and Wirth Gallery in New York City in fall 2019. I showed the students Amy Sherald's best known painting, which is her portrait of Michelle Obama, which is at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., which is not too far from Baltimore. And as we were doing this, one of the students in the room who lived in New York, was in New York, said, oh, I went to see that show at Hauser and Wirth Gallery in Chelsea. Yeah, I was there with my mom. And at that moment, I felt, if nothing else happened in the whole semester, we had made a strong connection right away between students' lives and what they had seen and experienced and Austen's novel, thanks to Amy Sherald. She's based in Baltimore. And I hope that one day it will be possible to invite her to Goucher and hear from her about this painting and her other works. Her paintings in this series are of every people, every man, every woman, every people. She doesn't give the paintings the names of individuals. And so she encourages us as we see this, panoply of life-sized, very realistically up to a point, delineated people to think about the faces, the humans whom we see around us every day, and people who we might feel look like us, don't look like us. So this was my opening gambit for a course that had as its key aim introducing these first year students to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice here and now at Goucher, of course, not literally at Goucher, and in the present moment. And our whole emphasis in the course was reading Pride and Prejudice together really slowly and starting with what the students noticed, what they responded to. So they wrote in online discussion forums, and then we had synchronous Zoom discussions together. We took virtual field trips. I am really looking forward to offering this course and being able to take people real places. But if you don't know Baltimore, I hope you will come visit someday, not just to see Goucher's Austen collection, but also because Goucher is the perfect place to think about Jane Austen's time period and connection to today. During Jane Austen's lifetime, Baltimore was a very prosperous port city, and prosperous people built houses that were informed by English design aesthetics, some of which still stand. And so when I can take my students places, we will be able to enter rooms that have the proportions that create the impression of an English room from Jane Austen's time. We can visit Ladue Topiary Gardens, which is a 20th century creation by an Anglophile visionary gardener. But there are ways right around Baltimore to, I will not say feel like you can step into Jane Austen's novels, but to have a three-dimensional experience that might illuminate Pride and Prejudice for you anew. And of course, our art museums, the Baltimore Museum of Art, principally will be a wonderful illumination. So that was our chief work. And I wanted to share with you, I'm sorry, this is a screen full of text, but I wanted to share with you the prompt for the main essay assignment that I used in that course. And you can see it comes right out of my newfound commitment to relatability. And I should say, as background for this, the first year seminar students, this course is a general education requirement. So every incoming student at Goucher takes it. And likely these are not students who will plan to major in literary studies or even minor in it. This is not a course that introduces them to the discipline. It is supposed to be a very, very different kind of course. And for any of you who are secondary teachers, I always think of my incoming first year students as secondary students who are transitioning into college students. By the end of our first semester, they are college students, but when they come to us, they are high school students. And so this is the course where I think most about, and I invite the students to talk about their experiences of literary study to date. What were they asked to read or required to read in high school? What did they read on their own? What do they gravitate towards? How have they been taught? What have they been taught they can and cannot do when thinking about literature? What have they been encouraged to do? And so with all of that in mind, the prompt, as you see, encouraged them to articulate and reflect on connections between Pride and Prejudice, Austen's novel, and our world today. And I let them steer their own course here about whether they wanted to focus on the concepts or gender as a theme, character types, continuities and changes in power, money, and social class, or what's important, as you see, about family relationships and friendships and love relationships. As you can imagine, from a wide open prompt like this, I got every single essay was distinct, individual, represented what that student had to say after many weeks reading and discussing. And they were really insightful. They were not traditional analytical essays, definitely, but they were much, much more than just off the cuff responses to reading Austen. And that's it from me. I wanted to really leave as much time as possible for the next stage of our conversation, where Danielle and Inger will share some of the questions that are coming up in the chat, and I will offer what insights I can. I want to be very clear in acknowledging the amount of expertise that is present in this webinar and not just sitting in my office. And so I hope to, I will be taking notes as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Juliette. I have gotten so many new ideas of questions to ask in classrooms. And I actually have a question of my own I want to start off the Q&A with. You mentioned virtual field trips. And I know we're all hoping that we won't need it in the near future, but I'm thinking for perhaps university or secondary instructors who might not live somewhere where physical field trips would be a possibility. Can you tell us more about what these virtual field trips are and how you use them in the classroom?
Oh, virtual field trips makes them sound very grand. I hoped early last summer, when it was clear that Goucher would likely be all remote, I began getting in touch with cultural and historical institutions around Baltimore to see if we could do a real virtual field trip. And they all said, here's our video tour. So it was video tours. It was pre-existing video tours, but in some cases, ones that would not have been publicly available. So there is if you're familiar with Johns Hopkins University, it has the undergraduate and graduate programs are located on the so-called Homewood campus. And Homewood takes its name from Homewood House, which is a beautiful, extremely expensive for its era summer house, in the sense that it's a couple miles north of the Baltimore harbor and port, just enough so that, you know, in Jane Austen's era, you would escape to the cleaner air, outside the city limits. And Homewood House is part of the Johns Hopkins University Museums, and I've visited there in person many times. And I knew that the students at Johns Hopkins through the Museum Studies program had been doing more research, guided research on the history of enslaved people living and working at Homewood House. And so Homewood is an example, one of two in the Baltimore area, at least, of institutions doing a version of the work that Jane Austen's House Museum is now in the press for doing, considering what are the connections between this place, its former occupants, its objects, its visitor experience, and not just the family who bought the objects, but other people who lived here and worked and whose work in many cases created the wealth that bought the objects. So the Homewood House did not have any kind of video tour online, but its director graciously sent me one and I could use it with the students. The other big institution, big in the sense that it was the largest house in America at its time. That's its claim to fame. Not that the family is famous or influential, but it was the biggest house in America in the 1770s. It is, as the crow flies, a mile from Goucher. I can see it from the Goucher campus. It's called Hampton Mansion or Hampton Estates. It's administered by the National Park Service, strangely. It and Fort McHenry are the National Park Service's properties around Baltimore. And thanks to scholars at the University of Maryland, Hampton has been researching enslaved people on that property and has been incorporating their stories and findings into their visitor experiences. So the National Park Service had made available a 3D tour, like various virtual things. Nothing, unfortunately, custom made for 17, 18, and 19-year-olds reading Pride and Prejudice. But the students were able, I was very impressed, they were able to do the work of connecting. And even a little video tour of Ladue Topiary Gardens, like what good is it to see gardens on a screen? The students said that they really appreciated and got a lot out of that too, and that gardens aren't just for middle-aged people like me, that they appreciate gardens as well. So we did a lot. They appreciated the change of pace. But because it was all virtual, and because certain institutions like Jane Austen's House Museum have really upped their game in virtual tours and in video tours, we visited Chawton. And I don't know if I would have done that in an ordinary year, showed a video tour of Jane Austen's house, but it fit right in if that was the kind of experience we were having elsewhere. And I would certainly do that again. I always, as you can imagine from my research interests, I always emphasize Jane Austen's authorship, her publishing career, her reception of her novels. And so having some images of place associated with that, being able to talk about how a museum is made and what contribution our Goucher collector Alberta Burke made to that museum when it was new. This was all strands that we were able to bring out.
There's a great question about modern adaptations of Austen. So this person asks, so the current adaptations often are working in people of color, or at least often used flexibly, so more often than before. And yet the white characters aren't displaying realistic attitudes about race. So we don't often see white characters expressing the sort of racist views that in a realistic world that they would be expressing. What would you say about that? Is it problematic that the white, quote, good guys do not behave more realistically?
And this really is a question that relates to Bridgerton strongly, also to the Dev Patel, David Copperfield, which I think is so worth seeing with students and talking about, but doesn't resolve, its own contradictions in any way. I mean, I think that's a perfect question to show to the students. If your students are like my students, they believe themselves to be very savvy and knowledgeable consumers of all media, everything. And many of my students hope to be creators. They hope to be creative writers, or they hope to create video games or films. And so they love to chew on questions like, well, what will we do when we have the power to adapt? What will we do that's different? And as you can see and hear from what I've presented so far, I really err on the side of open-ended questions that students can answer, rather than I really try not to direct them unless there's a purpose to it. And so in my experience, once you open up a question about representation, the students will run with that question, and they will see what diversity of views there is in the room. They will be the ones who say, oh, I recognize Lady Catherine de Bourgh because in my parents' home village in Cameroon, like there's the boss lady and she is just like that. You know, you can't, it has to come from the students. You have to, whatever you do, create a comfortable atmosphere in which they can begin to think, oh, I recognize something here. I see how this works. But also, yes, definitely invite them to think, what will they do differently? How can it work?
So actually, some of what you just mentioned was exactly what we had in mind in creating this essay competition. It's a creative writing competition that's going on right now. And I'd highly encourage anyone who's listening to enter, or getting any of your students to enter. It's only 500 words, and it's a retelling of the opening of Pride and Prejudice from a more modern and diverse point of view. So hopefully it'll engage people similarly. We have a nice question from Maria Biagioli, who's we all know from Brazil. Many of us know from Brazil. Maria is quoting Sonia Kamal, who wrote in Unmarriageable, "In a country where marriages continue to be arranged on the basis of convenience, pedigrees, and bank balances, Elizabeth's spurning of the self-righteous Mr. Collins and the pompous Mr. Darcy were defiant acts we could look up to." So she's writing about her own experience in Pakistan. So Maria asks whether you think the relatability of gender surpasses the obstacles for relatability of race, which could also explain why we have so many Pride and Prejudice retellings in different cultures and ethnicities.
Yes, I think so. In my experience, what students say, oh, my grandmother really wants me and my sisters to get married. That's really all she cares about. I mean, she's proud that I'm at college, but until I get married, she feels her job isn't done. I recognize an aspect of Mrs. Bennet in her. In the longer chapter for the Routledge book, I write more about gender, and including, my students, many of them don't identify as women or men. They identify as non-binary or queer, other identities, and they're so hungry to find connections between the identities that they claim for themselves and characters in historical works of fiction. And it's tough. Jane Austen is writing about women and men. But even so, there are characters who the students will use to open up conversations, and they will say, Charlotte Lucas, could she be asexual? And so we think, well, what would that, Jane Austen observed the humans around her and created fictional characters informed by, but not limited by, those observations. Certainly there have been people throughout history who represented, the full panoply of humans that we have different names and categories and terms for today. How might we see a representation in a Jane Austen novel of someone who doesn't quite fit the gender categories of her time? Might you be able to draw a connection to someone like Charlotte Lucas? And it certainly leads to more interesting discussions than just, why did Charlotte want to marry Mr. Collins, from what's explicitly there in the text.
We have another lovely comment with a question. This one's from Gretchen Frank, who says that she's used Pride and Prejudice similarly in her first year composition courses, asking students to relate to various personal experiences. But I find that humor and judgment are part of the writing that matter to students, and that themes like love and family are ones that particularly resonate. As you read essays from your students, what trends do you see that helped you realize Austen's novel was relatable to 21st century student readers?
Oh, I'm so glad to have that question, because years ago, I also taught Pride and Prejudice in a first-year college writing course at Goucher. And I thought honestly, I feel that Pride and Prejudice works in almost any course that you can imagine. In that context, I was thinking about critical thinking and rereading. I was thinking about first impressions and judging again, reread Darcy's letter. How do you take it in the second time? And, things that are very relevant to writers and revision. Oh, I lost the thread. I'm sorry. Tell me just the end of that question again, please.
As you read through, especially your student papers this time of year, right?
No, I got it. Thank you.
What trends do you see that helped you realize Austen's novel was relatable?
Well, I actually have found that students respond strongly to the humor in contrast to your experience, Gretchen. There's always a day when students come in to the classroom or the Zoom room and one of them says, "That was really funny. Did you think that was really funny?" And then, several of them in the room acknowledge, "Yes, I laughed." And then the others, they'll think, "Oh, I didn't laugh. What was I missing? I could have laughed." And it's like it opens a door to them that they can recognize humor, and they can appreciate and enjoy humor, and they can think about what the humor is doing. And it's always comes as a surprise to them because they think of Jane Austen's novels as being so ancient. But so that's something that they relate to. I think they show me different attitudes towards the characters' development, the characters' evolution as selves. Most of them are not thinking about partnerships for themselves in any kind of permanent way, but they respond strongly to Austen's depictions of characters kind of, well, we would say, doing the work on themselves first, getting to know themselves, figuring out who they are, making thoughtful choices of partner. They respond strongly to Austen's depictions of anything related to mental health, wellness, mental illness. If I read Sense and Sensibility with students, they want to talk a lot about Marianne's illness and mind-body interactions and how is mental illness thought of at the time and what were treatments. These are very personal connections for many of my students. And they're interested in again, they have our words of today, like setting boundaries. Eleanor Dashwood sets strong boundaries with her mother and her sister. That's a way into Eleanor's strength and her sense. And Anne Elliot and persuasion, really a kind of paragon of self-care in our current terminology. Anne steps back, gives herself time to process things. She responds emotionally very strongly in the moment, but she knows what to do. She knows how to take herself out of the situation. She knows what to do to calm herself down. She's not reactive. These are kind of practical life skills that the students, I really want to think more about.
I have a question. This is just for me. So I'm using my prerogative to ask this question about the politics of teaching Austen as a person of color. So I know that you can't answer this question for personal experience, but you've thought a great deal about obstacles in the classroom to pedagogy, like Austen pedagogy. And from that point of view, I'm wondering what you would say. Well, just in general, what you've thought about this, how students are having trouble situating their own difference from the text. And so you're talking about how does a student who identifies as male engage with the text? How does a student who identifies as a person of color? People of color in front of the classroom are having to engage with everyone on the basis of whether or not we're understood to have implicit expertise as a person who shares a lot in common with the people in the text. When I teach texts like this, my students give me the benefit of the doubt because I'm talking about them in terms of race. So it's like, okay, you get that, right? Even if it's not race today, you get it. We're fine with that. If I was just teaching it with regard, in a general sense, I know what sort of obstacles I would be facing in the classroom. And I'm wondering what you would say about your sense of that yourself, how you think that works, how you would suggest that folks like me contemplate that.
This is a wonderful question for all of us. And I am such a work in progress, like many of us in this time. This is not what I was trained to think about as a teacher. Goodness, what was I trained to think about as a teacher? It's very distant now. But I have never gone into a classroom and introduced myself as a white person. I've never said, "I'm Juliette. I'm 46, I'm white, I have 2 children. You know, I tend to, I've never done that. I think it's probably about time to, you know, I introduced myself with my pronouns now and I didn't 5 years ago. I think it's probably time to be more explicit. But I don't want the spotlight to be on me if possible. I know that instructors have I know that what students believe they see when they look at us, whether that's physical disability, whether that's age, race, ethnicity, anything about us that looks like something to them is something that they will think about whether or not we explicitly address it. But I don't want the students to feel on the spot either. I don't want to make the students feel like they have to talk about race and their own experiences if they don't want to, or in ways that they're not comfortable with yet. So I think we all have choices. I think we get to know our student body, we get to know our institutions. Goucher's really trying hard to emphasize anti-racist pedagogy. Goucher has joined a new liberal arts college. Oh gosh, I can remember the acronym, but not what it stands for. Liberal Arts College Racial Equity Leadership Alliance is the term for it. Goucher's mission is about global education and social justice. And so I always, as a faculty member, I feel a need to connect Jane Austen to this place that I teach. And part of that was with this freshman seminar, first year seminar. But that's not an answer to your question really, but I would love to talk about that openly with my colleagues. And maybe that's a new frontier too. I have 2 colleagues who teach African American literature, and one of them is an African American person and one of them is a white person. And I don't know how much they've talked with each other about a topic that could be sensitive on both sides. But I can't see 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but I hope that when I look back at myself as a teacher, I have continued as a work in progress, continued to evolve.
So one of our participants is asking about in her experience teaching with many first-year college students who are often male students of color, and felt that Austen's language is inaccessible.
Yeah.
I'd like to tie that also to the issue of humor, which can be either a connector or a separator, right? Often humor relies on many shared assumptions in order to work. So any tips on either overcoming either of those things?
Oh, I so hear that on Austen's prose. I had a student years ago who asked if there was a no fear Austen comparable to the no fear Shakespeare that he had used in high school, on facing pages, the original text and a kind of modernized version. And I said, no one has done that with Austen yet, to my knowledge, at least not commercially. And so, we fall back on the same tips, which involve really small reading assignments. Go slow, listen to an audiobook while you're reading, read out loud in the classroom as much as humanly possible. But there's a limit to what you can do, I think, in a single course experience for any student who doesn't have a kind of rich lifetime of reading behind them in the English literary tradition. And so few of our students coming to undergraduate study now have a version of that for different reasons. I mean, it used to be more the case that students opting for a course in literature would have read at least some 19th century works on their own. Maybe they wouldn't have read all of Dickens, they wouldn't have read all of Dickens, but they would have read perhaps The Secret Garden, or they would have read Little Women from the American tradition. They would have had some 19th century prose in there somewhere. And we just can't take for granted that that's the case. So with students who are coming in really cold to Austen's prose and really at a distance from her representations, I'm not sure how much we can reasonably hope that the students will leave with an appreciative understanding of Austen. So I would just say, just be really open throughout about the challenges. Let the students tell you that it's difficult and listen to that, and just don't try to push it on the page count for reading. That's one of the biggest changes I think my colleagues and I are making in all of our courses, is just recognizing that students are less equipped to focus on their own and just chew through lots of chapters, and trying to think of creative ways of less is more, with the number of chapters, pages, books that we're reading. But audiobooks, also definitely audiobooks. Or, I mean, there are so many creative ways to use film adaptations, screen adaptations as a way in. And I always think back to the essay in the collection Jane Austen in Hollywood from years ago, in which a scholar teacher divided a class into two halves, and one half saw Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility film and then read Sense and Sensibility. And Inger, you probably remember who the author of this was.
But I remember the essay.
But the other was the reverse. And the students who watched the film first did much, much better with the novel. So just to recognize some familiarity with character names, some familiarity with plot serves you. And when this prose is alien and this world is alien and the book seems gigantic.
Actually, my favorite technique is just reading aloud.
Yeah.
And ideally having students read aloud. But I think that's the best key for understanding humor and also overcoming a fear of the language. And that's in the tradition of Austen, right? And her family in terms of reading aloud.
Of course. Yeah, I always say to my students, we need to hear Austen in our own voices. We need to hear her with American accents. We need to hear her in the way that we talk. And that's how we're experiencing her. So, the English actor who reads Austen beautifully on the audiobook is great. And our own voices is what we're about.
Thank you.
We have another wonderful question, but I'm going to start this one off with an anecdote of my own, because it had me thinking as well. I remember reading Northanger Abbey when I was a teenager, and at the time, the big thing at that time was Twilight, right? And that's how I viewed Northanger Abbey as a teenager reading it. Well, I was teaching Northanger Abbey this semester, and I was really worried because I didn't know if Twilight's still a thing. Do we still have that kind of experience of reading books? And all of my students, when we began our discussion, started talking about K-pop fandom and taking the fandom associated with music and applying it to Northanger Abbey. And I think this ties into this question from one of our viewers of how do students' responses to Austen change over time? And have you noticed in your career any trends towards the way that they respond to certain texts?
I definitely notice an immediate response, immediate changes whenever there's an influential new screen adaptation. So Autumn de Wilde's Emma, many students saw it on their own last year. They came back to it as part of our course. One of them said, and this was such a beautiful reminder of where students get their ideas about Austen. She said, all I knew about Jane Austen before taking this course was the trailers for the movie Emma. And the trailers suggested to me that Austen's world is vividly colorful and zany. So not the whole film, but just the trailers. I think that the influence of social media has been enormous. I think students, and we find this with all of the authors that we teach. I had a Virginia Woolf course last fall, and the students fessed up at the end of the course that their impressions about Virginia Woolf coming in were almost completely drawn from quotations that they had seen on social media. So that didn't exist. Students weren't forming their impressions that way when I started teaching almost 20 years ago. But I would have to stop and think, I think, to think about trends. I can think about individuals, but to think about trends, I think I reflect more on the changes in our profession. And when I started teaching, I never worried if my courses would enroll. And now it's a thing in my program, in my department, and for many of us. And I think, I don't know if the humanities are dying. I dearly hope not, but that was not something that I was kind of front and center in my thinking about planning, teaching, and meeting students where they are. I don't think I thought much about meeting students where they are when I started, because I was coming out of, elite and elitist grad student training. Hadn't really found my voice in my approach yet. So my poor students from early on.
So before I get into this next question, someone in the Q&A asked a version of the question to me that I asked to you. So I only think it's fair, just because I wouldn't normally like jump in with my own answer to a question, but sort of thanking you and following up on what your answer was. I think that it's so right on to say that there is value in acknowledging in the classroom implicit biases, that at least as a person of color at the front of a classroom, it makes a difference to me if my white colleagues acknowledge that they have a greater perceived authority, and if I acknowledge my own perceived my own implicit biases. Like if we are honest and lead with that, I actually think that makes a big difference in sort of being honest, setting a tone where we can all sort of be a little honest and be critical thinkers in that regard. So thank you for your answer to that, and hopefully that answered the person's question. I have a question here.
Can I jump in with two?
Oh, please do. Please do.
Thoughts on that?
No, please.
One of the ways that we enter into that conversation at Goucher is to talk about what students call us, because Goucher is a very first name culture in some programs. It so happens that I'm married to a physics professor, and the sciences call everybody doctor last name or professor last name, but many of us invite our students to call us by our first names if they're comfortable. And the humanities and different colleagues have different preferences with that, related very much to perceived authority. And many of my colleagues of color tell their students, please call me Professor so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so, like these are my titles, I earn these titles, it matters to me. And the kind of, white colleagues can just take it for granted that our students think that we should be here at the head of the class and we can all be first namey with each other. I think we're thinking a little bit differently about that too. But I also wanted to bring in a connection with my first year seminar. So the students are also, in their first semester, they're also taking, it's acronym time, they're taking a first year experience, which is a co-curricular, discussion-based experience led by trained student mentors. And the first year experience is the first component of an element of Goucher's general education, which currently goes by the name of race, power, and perspective. So the students are having conversations about implicit biases, and they're thinking about identity, and where the first year experience and the first year seminar come together is on the topic of microaggressions. Students talk about that in the first year experience, and then each first year seminar instructor is to develop an in-class workshop on microaggressions related to course content, if at all possible. And this was my first time taking the concept of microaggressions into Pride and Prejudice. There are not racial microaggressions in Pride and Prejudice, but boy, are there microaggressions related to social class, up, down, and sideways. And if you take the understanding of microaggressions, micro as interpersonal, not necessarily as small or minimal, a whole lot of rudeness that happens in Pride and Prejudice is kind of illuminated. And that's a way for students who don't necessarily have much to say personally about the experience of race, but they might have a lot to say about microaggressions that they've experienced as a person with a visible disability, or microaggressions that they've experienced, as a Muslim person, or aspects of identity that inform. Again, I am not very practiced at being in that conversation as more than a facilitator. I am not very practiced in talking about myself in a way that I feel is appropriate and doesn't take the attention away from them. But it's something that I want to get better at, because it's important.
This is great. I think you have all of us ready to enroll in Goucher.
Oh, please do.
We're all like, this is amazing. I'll pass it to Inger.
Yeah, I got one last, didn't want to stop quite yet. Juliette, I want to thank you for that for the use of that painting. I actually, having seen your essay in proofs, I used it in class this semester, and it was really, really interesting. And my students had similar observations to the ones that you just mentioned, but they also talked a lot about the window or the fenestration. Okay. And we tried to understand, how that might relate to issues of privilege or race, whether the fenestration was like separating this person from the city, or whether, the city was actually just cut up in bits, and whether, if separation, whether the separation was towards good fortune. Was it a good fortune to be an observing spectator, or was this like even a potentially racial biases separating the person from this greater city? So
wow,
just wanted to throw some of that in there and ask what you personally found in that painting. I thought we could circle back to the beginning by having gaining some of your thoughts on it.
Well, I would say, just as a matter of access, a small image of that painting is included in Peter Sheldall's review of Amy Sherald's show for the New Yorker. So that's online and out there. And I have received reproduction rights for the Persuasions Online issue. So once that's live, then Austen people would be able to find it really easily and use it. So I'm really grateful to Amy Sherald and her gallery for making that possible. I like to do what I said I did, but I didn't show it to you. I like to look at that image in relation to others from the same series too. And it's true, each of the people that Sherald has portrayed is wearing a very graphically colorful garment, dress, top, something. But I think you're right. I think that's the only one in which the graphic is itself suggestive of theme or identity, as opposed to being, a great kind of colorful polka dot dress that we would all, feel wonderful wearing. I didn't end up doing as much with that painting as my course continued as I had in mind to do at the beginning. I really wanted to come back to it more explicitly when we were reading Pride. And it was kind of in the back of our minds, but I definitely made a note for the next time I run the course, be sure to come back and think again. Students adored Pride. They just loved it. And they said, this is relatable. Of course, this is relatable. This is language that we recognize. So that I had a feeling, but it was really borne out.
Thank you. It's been great.
I don't know about relatability, but I do think these conversations are so fun. And you made this so helpful and so fun. So thank you so much, Juliette, for your lecture, for answering questions. And thank you to everyone in our audience. Please stick around, as we are about to tell you about how to submit to our creative writing contest and how to get involved in future Jane Austen and Company events. But before that, we would also like to take this moment to thank our sponsors for this program. That includes the Orange County Arts Commission and North Carolina Cares, Chapel Hill Public Library, and the Humanities for the Public Good Initiative at UNC Chapel Hill, who provided us with a critical issues grant to partially support this season's series. While their sponsorship ends with our final event of the series later this month, I'm crying inside, people. I'm going to miss our series. It's been so fun. We hope that we can rely on your own financial generosity as we work to offer programs like this moving forward. This support keeps our events free and open to the public, in addition to funding scholarships for middle and high school teachers who then send students into Juliette's classroom and the rest of ours as well. It is these educators who keep Jane Austen, her contemporaries, alive for the next generation of readers. And if you're present tonight, I'm sure that you can agree there is no such thing as too many Austenites, or so we say. As a nonprofit, contributions of any amount are not only tax deductible, but they also go so far in showing how Jane Austen's work and world matter now more than ever. Thank you for considering where our organization fits into your own giving. And allow me to now hand things over for a brief word from one of our partners, the Chapel Hill Public Library.
Hello, my name is Maya James. I'm a staff member here at Chapel Hill Public Library. And on behalf of the town of Chapel Hill and the library, thank you so much, Juliette, for a great presentation. We're so pleased to be teaming up with Jane Austen and Company on the Race in the Regency, and we're especially excited about this special contest you've heard about earlier, happening this spring as part of the series. The contest is titled A Truth Universally Re-Acknowledged, a Pride and Prejudice Writing Contest. The challenge is to imagine Jane Austen's beloved story in a new context, real or imagined, and submit your 500 to 1,000 word adaptation of the first scene or chapter of Pride and Prejudice for a chance to win admission to the Jane Austen Summer Program, which you'll hear more about in just a moment. Submissions are due May 10th, so that's just next week. Our judges are Martha Waters, author of To Have and to Hoax, Susan Brown, director of Chapel Hill Public Library, and Sonia Kamal, author of Unmarriageable, who we also heard a lot about tonight. Submission for the contest is now open at chapelhillpubliclibrary.org/writing contest. And the contest is open to anyone of any age. If you have any questions, you can call the library or send me an email at mjames@townofchapelhill.org. That email is also on the writing contest webpage.
And before you guys go, we would like to invite you to our final event in the Race in the Regency series. I can't believe it's already here. This has gone by so fast, but we have a really special presentation by Devoni Loser, Slavery, Anti-Slavery, and the Austen Family. That'll take place 2 weeks from now, May 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern. You can register for this event for free on our website at janeaustenandco.org/sign up. We hope to see you guys all there as well.
And thank you to everyone who registered for JASP this year. As you likely know, we are all sold out. But if you have registered, there's still time to make your experience a little bit more interesting, to add on a little bit. You can purchase a deluxe Regency parcel until May 15th. We extended that deadline. And if you are coming to JASP and are a middle school or high school teacher, educator, you can join our new experience called JASP Plus. You can find more about both of these things on our website at janeaustensummer.org. And if you missed registration this year, please be on the lookout for Jane Austen and Shakespeare in 2022. The only other way to attend JASP this year is to submit and win our creative writing contest. So if you missed registration and you're eager to come, submit a story and maybe you'll get to join us. Thank you.
And I just want to mention that we had another 5-continent event tonight. We had participants from Italy, Australia, Argentina, and Brazil, and India, as well as our usual North American attendees. So thank you, everybody. We would love your feedback on your experience with this series and also ideas for future series, because we're not giving up. Even when we're going back in person, we still want to continue Jane Austen and Company. We're considering doing Asia in the Regency next, and curious what people think about that. We will be sending out a survey via email, so please be on the lookout for that, and love to have your thoughts on what went well and what you'd like to have in the future. Thank you all once again for attending. Thank you, Juliette, for a great presentation and discussion, and we hope you all remain healthy and safe until we meet again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great evening.